Hello, and welcome to the Providence College podcast. I'm your host for today, Michael Hagan, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. Here at the Providence College podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Friar family. Today, I'm speaking with Father Patrick Mary Briscoe, Associate Chaplain, about Pope Francis's recent encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti. Father Patrick, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a privilege. I mean, anytime I can talk about the Holy Father and about his project, I am more than willing to do so. So thanks for having me on.
So my first question, because it's a word that we don't really hear that often, is what is an encyclical and what does it mean for the Pope to write one?
Yeah, that's right. That's the great place to start because you say an encyclical letter and, on the one hand, you can say, well, I don't know what that is and I don't care about it. The reason you should care about it, though, is because an encyclical letter is an address, a letter written by the Holy Father to all people of goodwill. So this is one beautiful thing that we've seen change in the papacy in the modern era. Encyclical letters used to be written just to the church. But now these encyclical letters, and this is very important in the context of Fratelli Tutti, are written for everyone who would be willing to read it. So they're addressed to all people of goodwill. And usually an encyclical letter is about a particular theme, about a particular topic. So in the past, for example, popes have written encyclical letters about social doctrine. They've written them about theological points, clarifying theological questions. And now with Fratelli Tutti, we have a kind of outreach of Pope Francis writing on a very broad theme about the universal brotherhood between all men and women.
Now, the Pope's stated inspiration in this letter, as well as in his last encyclical letter, Laudato Si, is St. Francis of Assisi. What does Pope Francis draw from St. Francis's teaching and example in this letter?
When the Holy Father took his name, many people know this, right after Pope Francis was elected, there was a cardinal that reached out to him, and he said something to the effect of, remember the poor. It was something like that. So this is in the conclave right after the papal election. And that so impacted Pope Francis that when he chose his name, he took his name after Francis of Assisi, who was the great servant of the poor. And these last two encyclical letters, both Laudato Si, as you mentioned, Michael, and Fratelli Tutti, embody the charism, the spirituality of St. Francis of Assisi. So St. Francis was known as a kind of lover of creation in the most beautiful and profound sense, right? Recognizing that everything we have comes from God and it should, for that reason, not just be cast off. And here in Fratelli Tutti, we have a sense of another great aspect of St. Francis's charism, which is a love for the poor, a love for all people. There's a very beautiful moment in the life of Francis of Assisi where he travels to the Holy Land and he wishes to talk to a Muslim sultan, and he wants to proclaim to him the Catholic faith. Now, in the end, St. Francis was unsuccessful in converting this man to Christianity, but the offer, the integrity of discourse, the going out to meet people, that for Pope Francis is very important. And so something of that spirit of reaching out to everyone is embodied in the letter and is moved, it has moved its purpose, let's say. So for that reason, Pope Francis titled it actually Fratelli Tutti, which is a line which comes from the writings of St. Francis of Assisi. So he has this little book of pieces of advice that he wrote to his followers. Again, this is St. Francis of Assisi, this little book of advice that he wrote to his followers called the Admonitions. And one of the admonitions says, "Let us all, brothers, consider the Good Shepherd, who to save his sheep bore the suffering of the cross." So this idea, let us all brothers, look to the Good Shepherd. That's where the origin of the title comes from, and the spirit of the letter. May every person, Fratelli Tutti, all brothers, look to Christ, the Good Shepherd.
Now, Pope Francis roots his message in Fratelli Tutti in the biblical parable of the Good Samaritan. And for anyone unfamiliar with the parable, it's a story in which a man is attacked by robbers and left for dead on the side of the road. Two holy men pass him on the road and ignore him, going on their way. But a Samaritan, whose people were despised by the Jews, stops and helps the man. He tends to his wounds and takes him to an inn where he pays for his accommodations. He instructs the innkeeper to take care of the man and promises to cover any additional expenses when he returns. Upon telling the story, Jesus asks, which man was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? An expert in the law replies, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus tells him, go and do likewise. So how does Pope Francis interpret this parable for us, his audience? And how are we to understand ourselves in relation to the characters in the parable?
For me, this was absolutely the highlight of the letter. And in my own opinion, this is where Pope Francis is at his best teaching. He's sort of like having a Jesuit spiritual director for the church in this way, where he walks us through these biblical passages and just unpacks them and allows us to be reflective about our own lives and to see ourselves in the scriptures, making them relevant and meaningful to each person. That's what I really love. So I just want to say that about the letter in a general way, that it's this commentary, this reflection on the parable of the Good Samaritan that I think is just so profound, so beautiful. Pope Francis says, let us look to the example of the Good Samaritan. Jesus's parable summons us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of our respective nations and of the entire world, builders of a new social bond. This summons is ever new. So right away, the Holy Father is taking in a very serious way, addressing the real sufferings, the real struggles of the human community, everything that we've seen in 2020, right? We could just list off the litany, a broken and contentious politic, the struggles with the world pandemic, economic uncertainty. I mean, you could just keep going down the list. Within the church, right, we've seen the struggles and the way that the church, the difficulties that the church has had. That's what I want to say. The difficulties that the church has had addressing clerical sex abuse. There's just a whole list here of really deep challenges, of really deep human sufferings. And Pope Francis begins this meditation on the Good Samaritan saying, fundamentally, it is possible to reach out and to show acts of love in an ever new way. That the kind of sacrifice that charity demands isn't lost, that it's worth continuing to live, and that even as unconcern or indifference continue to appear in our world, that the call to love and to service continues to unfold in the depths of every human heart. I mean, this is so that's where it begins, right? That's the fundament of it, and it's powerful to say that this is not any kind of abstract moralizing. This isn't just some idea that's out there, but it's possible for each of us to live a new kind of encounter of love today, is a really important point, and something that people need to hear. They need to be encouraged right now. So I think that's why this meditation is so powerful and so moving, right at the heart. So to your question, though, Michael, where do we see ourselves? This is the second reason why it's so powerful. So not only does Pope Francis claim that some good can still be done, that love is going to continue to live despite these horrible human sufferings, it's powerful because he invites us into an examination of our own selves. We have to ask, are we robbers? Are we the ones who have beaten this passerby? Are we those who are seeking for justice for the wounded one? How should the robbers be dealt with? Are we passersby that don't want to get involved in helping the injured man? Are we actually the Good Samaritan? Are we the one who goes to take care of the wounded man? Or are we people that want to be Good Samaritans, but for some reason have something that inhibits us from showing our love? All of these kinds of questions are being asked, and it's a really powerful call to self-examination, to ask each person, should ask his or herself, who am I in this parable? Which one of these characters am I? How do I respond to the one that I see wounded and suffering right now? So again, the Holy Father reminds us that all of us have a responsibility to the wounded. And this is the gospel teaching of Jesus in Matthew 25. And that it's this act of love, this commitment to being a Good Samaritan, which will further the goods of fraternity and of social friendship.
One of the themes of the encyclical, in my reading of it, I think that Pope Francis, he's trying to draw our attention to the ways that we might not realize that we are like the passersby in the Good Samaritan story. He writes, "Let us admit that for all the progress we have made, we are still illiterate when it comes to accompanying, caring for, and supporting the most frail and vulnerable members of our developed societies." And then it's very shortly after that he writes the summons that you mentioned, which is his summons to us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of our respective nations and of the entire world, builders of a new social bond. So, what does this new social bond look like, and what does it mean to be citizens of our nation and of the world?
I think that one thing the Holy Father is speaking to here is a kind of latent myth that exists, certainly in the West and in American culture, and that is that things are always getting better. So some people call this the myth of progress, and I want to be a little bit careful here because there are obviously technological innovations that I'm 110% for. I
Here
love
we are
indoor
on
plumbing.
a podcast.
Like we're here on a podcast. I have my computer. I think email's great. I live out of my iPhone. All of these. So I'm not doubting the power of technology to make our lives better. But we can see if we're looking at the history of the ages from the perspective of Christianity, in every generation there is a challenge to the kind of fullest living of the gospel. And in that way, the kind of weakness of the human heart is evergreen. We're always finding new and creative ways to fail to live the gospel, and there is always in every generation a need for renewal and for conversion. So it's very tempting to want to glorify past ages and to say that, in this age, that age, there was a kind of fuller living of the gospel, and I don't think that's true. Nor do I think that it's true that things are always getting better. So I think those are two myths that are just common cultural myths that are in the air, and I think that the Holy Father is trying to dispel those. And then again, I tried to say earlier that there's a real note of optimism here and encouragement. So I really appreciate the lines of the Holy Father where he writes, "Each day offers us a new opportunity, a new possibility. We should not expect everything from those who govern us. That would be childish. But we have the space we need for co-responsibility in creating and putting into place new processes and changes." So he's dispelling any kind of idea of utopianism for the dedicated Christian. We know that heaven is not going to be here on earth, that a kind of experience of everything that we want or we need, a perfect life, balance and harmony, that ultimately exists with God on the other side of things. But here and now, each of us can do and should do and ought to do and is called to do certain things to help especially the wounded. So the Holy Father's call for each of us to look into our own lives and to recognize the moments where we ourselves are responsible for either where we ourselves are responsible for furthering injustice, or where we ourselves can further causes of good. We have to examine those, and if we're the ones doing the wrong, we have to stop. And if we're neglecting opportunities to do good, we have to embrace those, and we have to further the cause of gospel living and of right and just causes.
Now, Pope Francis describes us as being like, or one of the ways in which we are like the passersby in the Good Samaritan story is when we're governed by what he describes as the invisible dictatorship of hidden interests, under which those who claim to be detached and impartial critics of society, people who identify and recognize society's ills and at least say that we want to correct them. We criticize, yet we live off that system and its benefits. And this is referring to unjust economic and social arrangements. What are we to do with the fact that by living comfortably in a society rife with injustice and inequality, we tacitly endorse unjust systems?
Right. First of all, I think that's true. Everything that you just said, Michael. And I think that what we have to understand as Christians, what we have to embrace, is that accepting co-responsibility means, first of all, recognizing the ways in which I may be complicit in an injustice, and then second, beginning a kind of conversion of my own heart. So I think that people are tempted to dismiss the small ways that real change, that real righteousness, real charity. I think charity for Christians is a better word than change. That real gospel living comes about. So, for example, I think we can poo-poo the kind of fasting that we undertake during Advent and Lent as not having a real effect, but it in fact has a very great effect. If we begin to examine our own lives and begin to forego comforts that we enjoy in order to share goods with other people, this is a very great thing. This is not a small thing. This is an enormous change, and so I think it can look very much like just adopting a very simple practice in one's own life, and that's the beginning of something really great. So on every Friday, if Friday's a kind of traditional day of fasting and penance, right? Every Friday, don't go to Dunkin' and save that $3 and give it to a worthy cause. I think small actions like that are the ways that we begin to embody the kind of fidelity to the gospel, the kind of love of neighbor that the Holy Father is calling us to be thinking about here.
I'm interested in an image that Pope Francis uses. He uses the image of dark clouds to describe things that inhibit human fraternity. And now these dark clouds, they can be sort of acute, things that we are experiencing right now, like the COVID pandemic. But then these can also be age-old problems. These can also be economic injustice and inequality. These can be racial injustice and inequality. They can be things that have just arisen, or they can be things that have been with us for decades, centuries, millennia. But what I'm interested in with this image of the clouds is that clouds are something that are beyond human control. Now, Pope Francis's dark clouds that he describes, they're man-made, but they're so systemic that no one person's actions can break them. Clouds are something that we have to learn to live under and to create light in spite of. You actually just answered this question, which is how do individuals create light under the cover of those dark clouds? But is there anything more you want to say about how we are to live under the cover of these dark clouds?
Yeah, definitely. I love that you brought up the cloud imagery. So another thing, just a general comment about the Holy Father, is that Pope Francis is so poetic. He loves using poetic and literary allusions in his writing, and the clouds are just a very powerful image and should not be missed. So I appreciate everything that you said, the way you narrated their importance in the encyclical letter. That's not to be missed. Not every pope writes this way, and it's just interesting to comment about that. The reality of the clouds, though, is that he's also taking something which is a very Christian image, is that clouds cause darkness, and that the Christian quest is for bringing in the light. So I think one thing that I would add, so in addition to small ways that we ourselves can offer reparation for economic injustice, that's what I was suggesting in the coffee example, but ways that we can be people who disperse the darkness is by simply being faithful to the truth. So one of the things that the Holy Father mentions in the encyclical is the cacophony of social media. He comes down very hard against the use of social media, and he calls for new tones of discourse. And this is something that we all feel. Everyone mentions that social media is a cesspool, and we just kind of say it and accept it. But what we should be concerned about is fidelity to the truth. Is what I am reading true? This is a question that every Christian needs to ask himself. And I think we kind of do this in a small way, right? We think like, oh, is this source reliable? What news am I relying on to form my worldviews? If we're worried about the clouds, if we're worried about dispersing darkness with light, we must be a people that live for and of and in the truth. And I think that should be important for us at Providence College, since as a Dominican school, we are committed to this love of the truth and this relentless pursuit of the truth. But we have to realize that there's something vocational in that, that pursuing the truth has has a kind of call that's not only a call to conversion, but a call to a way of life. So instead of getting caught up in the news cycle, we have to pursue we have to pursue we have to pursue the truth of the world. So when I say this word truth, I realize that I just kind of jumped into it without explaining what I'm really calling for here. But we have to be concerned with ultimate things, with the deepest things, and not just kind of the flight of day-to-day living. I think that's another way that we get tossed about in the clouds, is we allow ourselves to be detached from the priorities of life, family life, of religion, the kinds of things that anchor us, and that allows us to get lost in the clouds, instead of bringing light. When we're anchored to these things, when we're faithful to the truth, we can be a people that brings light to the world. So I hope that sort of gets at weaving those things together, Michael.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you mentioned social media there. Because yeah, the Pope Francis, he writes about what he calls the illusion of communication in digital media, and in another moment where he waxes poetic, he says digital media. He talks about the multi-sensory experience of communication, and how digital media lacks physical gestures, facial expressions, moments of silence, body languages, and even smells, trembling hands, blushes, perspiration, that speak to us and are a part of the human condition. He says that digital media do not really build community. It's not capable of uniting humanity. Now, we've all seen people say things, and we've all even possibly said things ourselves in a tweet or a Facebook comment that we wouldn't say in person.
Right,
But at
right.
the same time, digital media has held us together amid this historic pandemic. So, what has our campus's experience with remote learning and activities taught us about the possibilities and limits of digital communication as an occasion and an avenue for grace?
Yeah, that's right. So in the ministry, I could talk about the ministry's perspective. One of the first things we did was we built an app for campus ministry to use this year. I'm recognizing that we were going to need new ways to get in touch, and we hoped that a different and distinct and particular app would provide an avenue for religious life on students' phones. So many of us just live out of our phones, as I said earlier in the conversation. So it's not that I see no value in any of these projects. I mean, we've been live streaming masses. We have a daily homily. We've been recording music and releasing meditations and doing all kinds of stuff on the Torch app for students and alumni. But you recognize the part that I want to lean into here is that you recognize the limitation of it, that it can keep you connected to something if you've already had an experience of it. This is one thing that I've come to believe personally. So I'm not putting anything on the Holy Father's lips here, but I think that digital communication can sustain us if we already have an experience of something. But if the digital communication is your only experience of something, it's very limited. So, for example, last semester I was in the classroom, and when we transitioned from in-person learning to digital learning, that was very easy for me because I'm relatively technologically competent, and I, importantly, already had an experience of those students. I knew them well. I knew their interests. I could read their reactions. I could, more or less see where they would be coming out of. But I don't think that's possible to cultivate that kind of community in a digital environment. I think that it can sustain. Again, I think that the digital resources can sustain something if you already have an experience of it. But I don't think it can create or really foster an experience of life. It's the reason why coming to BC is so important. So early in the year, Father Sagard called Providence College a thin place, a place where one could feel close to God and close to higher things. And I think that's true. And I think that that's true because of the nature of the community and the nature of the experience and the project that we're sharing here. And there's something that is lacking when you're not able to come to the place, or if your experience of the place is only digital.
Do digital media and digital spaces, do they change in any way the definition of who is my neighbor?
Yeah, this is a great question. That's excellent. I think the answer to that is absolutely, because Christ's point is in the Good Samaritan that your neighbor is everyone you encounter. And I do think that online media have provided new new places of encounter, new ways to meet people. There's a very beautiful aspect to this, of course. You can interact with people who have very different views from you. That's one thing that I'm so grateful for from my Dominican vocation. I was mentioning this in a class this week. I'm so grateful to be part of the international order because it has exposed me to so many people. I've had the opportunity to travel a lot within the order in the before time, of course, not now. But that has just broadened my heart in ways that I couldn't have expected. And I do think that digital media does that. I'm sort of a if the podcast can become a little bit confessional for a moment, I'm a total news addict. And I love Twitter for this reason, because I can see what's going on or I can see a version of what's going on in so many different communities globally. And it's been fun to continue to build relationships, especially with other Dominicans through these media throughout the world. So I think that part is very great. But it does mean that there is a certain responsibility here. I think one thing that I would say about digital media is that it's very easy to build a false self. It's very easy to hide parts of who one is online, out of fear, out of disinterest, and so we can build a kind of profile that only shares one part of who we are. And I think this kind of fracture of the person is very dangerous, and that in particular I would caution against.
Pope Francis writes that social friendship and universal fraternity necessarily call for an acknowledgement of the worth of every human person, always and everywhere. Reading this, I was struck by how similar it sounds to the refrains of some protest movements who say that nobody is free until everybody is free, and that all lives can't matter until Black lives do. Now, understanding that Fratelli Tutti has a global audience and is not necessarily is not specific to current events in the United States, understanding this, what wisdom does Fratelli Tutti offer to those struggling for racial justice in the United States?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Part of what the Holy Father wants us to do is to excise from our common discourse any kind of doublespeak, and that we have to accept a kind of integrity of what's going on before we can begin to heal and to grow. After, in the next paragraph, so that was 106 that you were quoting there, Michael. In the next paragraph, the Holy Father writes, "Every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally. This fundamental right cannot be denied by any country." So it's clear that he's offering a kind of political platform here. Now, in the United States, of course, we know in our own history of the plight of African American people. And until we can talk about that in a very frank way, I do think that we will be dismissing or limiting the cause for the recognition of the rights and dignity of every human person. I think that's absolutely true, and I think that's in the American context. That's one thing that the Holy Father can be calling us to here. I do think that we need to that we can as Americans have easy access to a lot of the Holy Father's language because it's in actually our founding documents. So the idea that there are inalienable rights that every person has because they are a human person. Rights to family life, rights to free worship, rights to free speech. These are things that belong to people because they are in fact people. The more that we talk about fundamental rights and what they mean, the greater or more easily the causes of justice will flourish. I think too that Fratelli Tutti is powerful because it exists in a Christian context. The Christian idea of recognizing someone as being beaten on the road that needs to be loved, to get back to the Good Samaritan idea, means to love someone as you, your own self, love. So to recognize in the other, not another, but to recognize in the other you. That's what Christianity does. That's what Jesus does. He allows us to see in the marginalized, not someone else, but him, and therefore us, because we are united to him. So the call to concern for another's plight socially is not just another cause for Christians. It's not just another political movement. It has to be something deeper than that, because we recognize in every suffering person our God and ourselves. That's what that's the gospel's call. And so there's something very radical here about which the Holy Father is trying to remind us, and we should be thinking of that in the American context. It's the us them that is so destructive, and instead the recognition that part of the gospel, in fact the very core of the gospel, means to consider the other as brother or sister.
What is Fratelli Tutti's most challenging call to people of goodwill?
That's a great question. I would say I would put emphasis on this call to personal conversion, that this is the thing that's missed, that Christianity doesn't have a political platform. We can adopt certain Christian principles, and they can and should animate our politics as we strive towards the common good. I believe those things, of course. But I think that the fundamental message of Fratelli Tutti is charity. That Pope Francis claims that charity is at the heart of every healthy and open society, and that charity, when accompanied by a commitment to the truth, is more than personal feeling. I think that we have to recognize this deep relationship between charity and the truth, and allow for the kind of conversion of heart, promote the kind of conversion of heart that fights any kind of form of relativism, that fights any kind of political injustice, that fights our broken communications, or at least a threatened communication by digital media, that fights all of the ways that Fratelli Tutti talks about the fragmentation of our human culture. So one can read this document and one can see a kind of activist pope calling for vague utopianism. That would be a misreading, because what the Holy Father is actually calling for is a deep conversion of heart, and I think that's tough, and that will be difficult to people to see, because that requires the eyes of faith.
Pope Francis closes Fratelli Tutti with an ecumenical Christian prayer, which, as we close here, I'd like to read. O God, Trinity of love, from the profound communion of your divine life, pour out upon us a torrent of fraternal love. Grant us the love reflected in the actions of Jesus, in his family of Nazareth, and in the early Christian community. Grant that we Christians may live the gospel, discovering Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother or sister who makes a new start. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. Amen. Father Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure and a privilege.
Subscribe to the Providence College podcast in all the usual places, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.